The crackling begins softly at first. Dry wood shifts and pops as the first tendrils of smoke rise from beneath the carefully arranged pyre. A man stands atop it, bound to a stake, his eyes wide with the terrible knowledge of what's to come. The crowd has gathered, hundreds of faces illuminated by the growing flames, to witness justice delivered through fire. He feels it first at his feet. A warmth that might almost be pleasant on a winter's day quickly transforms into searing pain as his skin begins to blister. The heat climbs higher, relentless in its ascent. His lungs burn with each desperate breath, drawing in scorching air and acrid smoke. There is no quick death here, no honourable end by the sword, no glorious fall in battle that bards might sing of. This is a death that erases, a death that consumes not just flesh, but identity itself. A death that, to the Norse warriors, watching from the edges of the crowd, represents something more terrifying than mere physical agony. For a people who built their entire cosmology around the idea of remembrance, around tales of heroic deaths and names echoing through eternity, the flames represent an obliteration beyond the body. The fire grows higher now. The man screams, becoming inhuman as the flames claim him. And in the eyes of the Norse onlookers, there is a unique kind of horror. The recognition that this death offers no path to Valhalla, no honoured place among ancestors, no saga to carry one's name forward. Even for the Vikings, a culture that perfected the art of brutal execution, that celebrated violence as a pathway to glory, and that faced death with stoic courage. The burning stake represented a terror beyond imagining. This is the story of fire's transformation from sacred element to ultimate punishment. This is the story of why even the most feared warriors in medieval Europe trembled at the thought of being burned alive, a fate worse than their most gruesome inventions. This is the story of humanity's most terrifying method of execution, and the complex psychology, symbolism, and history behind the flames that consumed not just bodies, but souls. The orange glow of flames dances across cave walls, illuminating the faces of our earliest ancestors. Here, huddled against the primordial darkness, humans first discovered fire's dual nature: life-giving warmth and protection, juxtaposed against its capacity for terrible destruction. This duality would shape humanity's relationship with flame for millennia to come. Fire was never merely a tool. From the moment humans first captured and controlled it, some 400,000 years ago, flame became imbued with profound symbolic significance. It was divine gift and cosmic power, the element that separated humanity from other creatures. In nearly every ancient culture, fire occupied a sacred place in religious and social life. In Norse cosmology, fire was both creator and destroyer. The primordial realm of Muspelheim was a land of fire, its destructive force balanced against the ice of Niflheim, creating the conditions for life itself. The fire giant Surtur was destined to burn the world at Ragnarok, the end of all things. Yet fire also warmed the hearths of Viking longhouses, cooked their food, forged their legendary weapons, and cremated their honoured dead. Fire is the purest manifestation of transformation, explains Dr. Elise Thorvaldsen, specialist in Norse religious practices at Uppsala University. For the Vikings, it represented both creation and destruction, purification and punishment. This ambivalence made it particularly powerful as a symbolic tool. The Romans understood this duality as well. In their temples, the Vestal Virgins tended sacred flames that represented the continued prosperity of Rome itself. Yet these same Romans would use fire to execute criminals in spectacular displays of state power. The sacred and the profane aspects of flame existed in perpetual tension. Across the ancient world, from Persia to China, from Africa to the Americas, fire served as intermediary between humans and gods. Sacrifices were carried to deities on columns of smoke. Eternal flames burned in temples. Ritual fires marked seasonal transitions and life passages. Fire divination, reading patterns in flames or smoke, guided important decisions. In Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest continuously practiced religions, fire temples housed sacred flames that represented divine presence itself. To pollute fire was to commit sacrilege against the divine order. The Zoroastrian perspective highlights a crucial understanding. Fire's purity made it an agent of purification. This concept of purifying flame appears repeatedly across cultures. Gold is refined by fire. Impurities burn away, leaving only what is pure and true. This metaphorical understanding would later transform into a terrible literal application. The idea that human sin could be burned away from the social body through the execution of transgressors. Yet for early Germanic and Norse peoples, fire held additional significance beyond its sacred aspects. The hearth fire represented the continuity of the family line and the ancestral connection. The flames that burned in a Viking longhouse were sometimes maintained for generations, symbolising unbroken lineage. To be cast out from the fire, to be denied its warmth and light, was to be severed from the community and kin group. The hearth was the literal and metaphorical centre of Norse family life, notes Dr. Thorvaldsen. Being welcome at the fire meant belonging. Being denied the fire meant social death. This context makes what comes next all the more significant. For when humans transformed fire from sacred element to method of execution, they weren't simply employing a practical means of killing. They were weaponizing a cosmic force charged with profound cultural, religious, and social meaning. The earliest recorded instances of execution by burning appear in ancient Babylonian law codes. The Code of Hammurabi, dating to approximately 1754 BCE, prescribes burning for specific transgressions, particularly those involving sacred boundaries or sexual taboos. A woman who committed incest with her son, for instance, would be burned. The punishment was reserved for violations that threatened not just social order, but cosmic order. For the ancient world, fire executions served a purpose beyond mere punishment or deterrence. They were acts of purification, removing dangerous pollution from the community through the most transformative element available. The condemned wasn't simply killed, they were unmade, their very substance converted to ash and smoke. This concept would find particularly fertile ground in the monotheistic religions that would later dominate Europe. But before Christianity transformed burning into the signature punishment for heresy, the Vikings and their contemporaries had already developed their own complex relationship with fire as punishment, one that reveals much about their worldview and their deepest fears. As we turn to examine how the Norse people employed burning as execution, remember that for a culture that celebrated glorious death and expected warriors to face their end with unflinching courage, their specific horror of burning reveals something profound about Viking spirituality and their understanding of what constituted a fate truly worse than death. The longship's dragon-headed prow cuts through the mist as oars dip rhythmically into the cold waters of the fjord. Aboard, grim-faced warriors prepare for what lies ahead. Among their weapons and shields rests a different kind of tool. Torches, not yet lit, but ready to bring flame to their enemies' halls. For the Vikings, fire was a weapon of war, but it was also something more, a method of execution reserved for the most reviled offenders. Despite popular misconceptions of Vikings as indiscriminately bloodthirsty, Norse society operated under sophisticated legal codes. Thing assemblies, open-air gatherings where free men debated and decided matters of law, determined guilt and punishment with remarkable procedural consistency. Their legal system recognised gradations of crimes and corresponding punishments. Viking-age Scandinavians had a nuanced approach to justice, explains Dr. Magnus Larsen of the University of Copenhagen. Different methods of execution carried different symbolic meanings. They weren't randomly cruel. Their punishments were calibrated to the nature of the transgression. The most common Viking executions included beheading, hanging, drowning, and the infamous blood eagle, a ritualised killing involving the cutting of ribs from the spine and pulling the lungs outward to form wings. Each method carried specific connotations and was typically reserved for particular categories of offence. Burning, however, occupied a special category. The clearest evidence for Viking use of fire as execution comes from both archaeological findings and literary sources, particularly the Icelandic sagas. These narratives, while written down centuries after the events they describe, preserve older oral traditions and provide valuable insights into Norse cultural attitudes. Njal's saga, one of the most renowned Icelandic sagas, centres around a house burning, Old Norse brennu, that claims the lives of the saga's namesake, Njal Thorgeirsson, and his family. Though not a formal execution, but rather an act of vengeance, the burning horrifies even the saga's hardened warriors. The perpetrators are condemned not just for the killings, but specifically for the method chosen. It was not the death itself that was seen as dishonourable, notes Dr. Larson, but the manner of it. To die by fire was to be denied the opportunity for bravery in one's final moments. It was a death without agency or dignity. Archaeological evidence from Viking burial sites reveals that while cremation was a common funeral practice, it was performed after death, not as the cause of death. The careful arrangement of grave goods around cremated remains shows that burning the dead was a respectful treatment, fundamentally different from execution by fire. When the Vikings did employ burning as execution, it was typically reserved for three categories of offenders. First were those who committed nidingsverk, works, or deeds of extreme vileness that violated fundamental social norms. These included secret killings, as opposed to open combat, oath-breaking, and particularly treachery against one's kin or lord. Such crimes struck at the foundation of Norse society, which depended on bonds of loyalty and honour. Second were those accused of cider, a form of sorcery particularly associated with manipulating others' minds or bringing harm through supernatural means. While some forms of magic were accepted in Norse society, malevolent sorcery was feared and reviled. The third category comprised religious transgressors, those who desecrated sacred spaces or objects. As Christianity began to spread through Scandinavia, burning sometimes became a punishment for those who refused conversion or who destroyed Christian symbols, though the historical record suggests this was less common than later Christian accounts claimed. The Eyrbyggja saga describes the burning of a woman named Katla and her son Odd for practicing harmful cider. After multiple instances of suspected magical attacks, the community finally takes action. They made a large pyre and burned Katla on it, and she died with much screaming and little honour. Then they took Odd and broke his legs and back before throwing him on the fire with his mother, and thus they both perished. This account highlights several key aspects of burning as Viking punishment. It was public, it was reserved for particularly feared offences, and it was considered a dishonourable death, one that even included the victim's suffering as part of the intended punishment. But why, in a culture that glorified violent death in battle, that practised other gruesome execution methods, like the blood eagle, would burning elicit special horror? The answer lies in the Viking understanding of death, afterlife, and remembrance. For the Norse, a proper death was essential for the journey to the appropriate afterlife realm. Warriors who died bravely in battle might be selected by Odin's Valkyries for Valhalla. Others might go to Freya's field, Folkvanger, or to Helheim, the more general realm of the dead. But this journey required proper treatment of the body and appropriate funeral rites. Burning as execution disrupted this cosmic process. It combined death and cremation into a single event, denying the community's role in proper funeral proceedings. It transformed what should have been a respectful post-death treatment into the mechanism of suffering and death itself. Moreover, in a culture where one's reputation after death, what the Norse called ODR, or breath, inspiration, soul, was considered a form of immortality, burning represented a particularly terrible fate. The condemned had no opportunity for brave final words, no chance to demonstrate courage in their final moments. Instead, their last breaths were screams of agony, their final expressions contorted by pain rather than resolute acceptance. The sagas repeatedly emphasise how one faces death, says Dr. Thorvaldsen. A good death involved facing your end with courage and often a memorable quip or observation. Burning denied this cultural script entirely. Perhaps most significantly, burning symbolically removed the offender from the community in the most complete way possible. Their body was not just killed, but destroyed, transformed to ash that would scatter rather than remain in burial mounds that served as focal points for ancestor veneration. Their very substance was removed from the physical world. For a culture that placed enormous emphasis on remembrance and on maintaining connections between the living and the dead, this represented a terrifying prospect, a death that led not to an afterlife journey, but to complete erasure. As we'll see, this power of fire to erase would be embraced with terrible enthusiasm by the Christian authorities, who would eventually displace Norse religious practices across Scandinavia and broader Europe. But the Vikings' particular horror of burning reveals something profound about their values, their emphasis on remembrance, on dignified death, and on maintaining proper boundaries between the living and the dead. Rise of burning in medieval Europe. The year is 1022, and a strange procession winds through the streets of Orleans, France. 13 individuals, clergy and nobles among them, are led in chains toward the city gates. They have been condemned not as murderers or thieves, but for something the growing Christian church considers far more dangerous: heresy. Outside the city walls, 13 stakes await, surrounded by wood and kindling. As the flames rise, Europe witnesses one of its first mass burnings for religious dissent, a grim harbinger of what the coming centuries would bring. As Viking influence waned across Europe and Christianity consolidated its power, burning alive transformed from an occasional punishment into the signature execution method for a specific category of offence: crimes against God. This shift reflected profound changes in how medieval European society conceptualised justice, sin, and the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority. The adoption of burning as the primary punishment for heresy wasn't arbitrary, explains Dr. Rebecca Coleman, medieval historian at Oxford University. It reflected a specific theological understanding of fire as purifying, as well as practical concerns about the spread of heretical ideas. The legal foundation for burning heretics developed gradually. Roman law, particularly the Justinian Code, provided precedent for using fire against those who threatened religious orthodoxy. But it was in the 12th and 13th centuries that systematic legal frameworks for identifying and punishing heretics through burning emerged. Pope Lucius III's decree, Ad Abolendam, 1184, and Pope Innocent III's policies expanded church authority to prosecute heresy. The Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, further codified procedures for heresy trials. By the time Pope Gregory IX established the Inquisition as a formal institution in 1231, burning had become firmly established as the appropriate punishment for those convicted of heretical beliefs. The Cathars of southern France and northern Italy were among the first to face systematic burning. This Christian sect, which rejected many Catholic doctrines and embraced dualistic beliefs about good and evil, faced brutal suppression during the Albigensian Crusade, 1209 to 1229. At Montségur in 1244, after a lengthy siege, more than 200 Cathar perfecti, spiritual leaders, were burned en masse when they refused to renounce their faith. A witness account, preserved in contemporary chronicles, describes the scene. They were dragged to the field where the stake had been prepared. No need to tell that they were burned with great joy. Indeed, many of the crusaders ran to grab burning brands to throw onto the pyre. This enthusiasm for burning reveals how thoroughly medieval Christian theology had transformed fire from a feared punishment into a spiritually necessary cleansing. The flames were seen not merely as punishment, but as purgation, a terrible mercy that might cleanse the sin from the soul even as it destroyed the corrupted flesh. Bernard Gui, a Dominican friar and inquisitor active in the early 14th century, articulated this perspective in his Manual for Inquisitors. The purpose of the punishment is not primarily the suffering of the guilty one, but rather the good of the community and the deterrence of others from similar crimes. The medieval mind saw heresy as a contagion that could spread through a community, corrupting souls and endangering salvation. Fire, with its purifying associations, became the logical response to this spiritual infection. Just as surgeons might amputate a gangrenous limb to save a patient, medieval authorities used fire to excise heretical elements from the social body. Yet practical considerations also influenced the choice of burning. Unlike other execution methods, burning destroyed the body completely, preventing the veneration of potential martyrs' remains. It also created spectacular public theatre that demonstrated both the power of authorities and the terrible consequences of deviation. Medieval executions weren't just about killing criminals, notes Dr. Coleman. They were elaborate performances that communicated social and religious messages to the assembled crowds. As burning became institutionalised, detailed protocols developed around it. Contrary to popular belief, many heretics were actually strangled before the flames reached them, a mercy granted to those who showed repentance. The unrepentant, however, faced the full horror of the flames. The location, timing, and arrangement of burnings were carefully choreographed for maximum impact. The expansion of burning coincided with significant changes in European legal systems. The shift from accusatorial procedures, where an accuser brought charges, to inquisitorial procedures, where authorities investigated proactively, transformed how justice functioned. Torture became a sanctioned method for extracting confessions, creating a terrible synergy with burning. The threat of flames often loomed over interrogation chambers. By the late medieval period, burning had expanded beyond heresy to encompass other offences that combined religious and social transgression. Witchcraft, sodomy, and sometimes poisoning or arson. These crimes shared a perceived quality of pollution or corruption that fire could symbolically cleanse. Jews frequently faced burning during periods of heightened religious tension or following accusations of host desecration, allegedly damaging consecrated communion wafers. In 1243 in Berlin, for instance, all the city's Jews were burned following such accusations. Similar incidents occurred across Europe, reflecting how burning had become the default punishment for perceived threats to religious purity. The medieval period also saw burning incorporated into apocalyptic imagery and religious art. Depictions of hell featuring sinners writhing in flames reinforced the connection between earthly burning and divine punishment. When heretics burned in town squares, the spectacle was understood as a preview of the eternal flames awaiting the unrepentant. This period marked a crucial transition in how burning was understood. What had been, for the Vikings and other early medieval cultures, a particularly feared and reviled punishment, became in Christian medieval Europe a spiritually necessary act. The Vikings had burned those who threatened social and cosmic order. Medieval Christians burned those who threatened spiritual order. But with the added dimension of believing, the flames offered a path to potential redemption. As we'll see in examining the witch-burning phenomenon that followed, this theological justification for burning would combine with social anxieties to create one of history's most terrible chapters, a period when the smoke from human pyres would darken skies across Europe. Witch burnings and heresy. The crowd presses forward, straining for a better view. In the market square of a small German town in 1593, an elderly woman is led to a stake. Her crime, according to the carefully documented trial records, is maleficium, harmful magic. Neighbours have testified that after quarrelling with her, their cows stopped giving milk, their children fell ill, and hail destroyed their crops. Under torture, she is confessed to consorting with the devil, attending sabbats and casting malevolent spells. As the executioner secures her to the stake, She looks out at faces she has known all her life, now transformed by fear and hatred. The kindling is lit. Another witch burning has begun. The witch hunts that swept across Europe from the 15th through the 18th centuries represent perhaps the most infamous application of burning as punishment. While popular imagination often exaggerates both the numbers, estimates suggest between 40,000 to 60,000 executions, not the millions sometimes claimed, and methods, many witches were hanged rather than burned depending on local laws. The witch-burning phenomenon reveals much about how fire punishment evolved to address new social anxieties. The early modern witch hunts weren't simply a continuation of medieval heresy prosecutions, explains Dr. Eleanor Hartwick, specialist in early modern European history. They represented a unique convergence of theological concerns, social stresses, and changing legal standards that made burning women as witches seem not just acceptable, but necessary. The legal foundation for witch burning developed through several key texts. The papal bull Summis Desiderantes Affectibus, issued by Pope Innocent VIII in 1484, officially recognised witchcraft as a threat requiring church action. This was followed by the influential Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by Inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, which provided detailed procedures for identifying, trying, and executing witches. While medieval authorities had occasionally prosecuted maleficent magic, the early modern witch hunts were distinguished by their systematic nature and their explicit connection of witchcraft to diabolism, the worship of, or pact with, the devil. This transformed witchcraft from a harmful practice into heresy, making burning the legally appropriate punishment. The typical witch trial followed a pattern: accusation, often following local conflicts or misfortunes, arrest and interrogation, frequently involving torture, confession, and execution. Most accused witches were women, though in some regions like Iceland and parts of Finland, men constituted the majority. And many fit a specific profile: elderly, widowed, socially marginal, and economically vulnerable. Johann Weyer, a 16th century physician who opposed witch hunts, described a typical case. An old woman, poor and perhaps begging for her sustenance, with sunken eyes, wrinkled brow, and bent with age, is accused by a neighbour of being a witch because after some quarrel, the neighbour's child fell ill or his cow died. The old woman is arrested, and since she has no defenders, is tortured until she confesses whatever her tormentors suggest. The geography of witch burning varied significantly across Europe. The Holy Roman Empire, particularly present-day Germany, saw the most intense persecution, with some towns executing dozens of witches in single episodes. The infamous Würzburg witch trials, 1626 to 1631, claimed over 150 lives, while the Bamberg witch trials, 1626 to 1631, resulted in approximately 300 burnings. Burning served specific symbolic functions in witch executions. As witches were believed to have physically consorted with demons and the devil, fire purified their corrupted flesh. The complete destruction of the body also prevented any possibility of the witch's corpse being used for further magical purposes. Some regions developed particularly elaborate rituals around witch burning. In parts of Scotland, witches were strangled at the stake before burning, a mercy not always granted elsewhere. In some German territories, gunpowder was sometimes placed around the witch's neck to hasten death once the flames were lit. French authorities occasionally specified that witches be burned alive rather than strangled first, particularly for aggravated cases. The social dynamics of witch burning differed from earlier heresy executions in significant ways. While heresy prosecutions typically originated from ecclesiastical authorities, witch accusations often bubbled up from communities themselves. Neighbours accused neighbours, creating cycles of denunciation that could rapidly spread through communities. The 1692 Salem witch trials in Massachusetts, though resulting in hangings rather than burnings, following English rather than continental legal traditions, exemplify how witch accusations could transform community relations. What began with accusations against a few socially marginal women quickly expanded to include respectable community members, eventually claiming 19 lives before authorities halted the proceedings. Economic and climate factors played significant roles in intensifying witch persecutions. The Little Ice Age, circa 1300 to 1850, brought crop failures, famine, and disease that heightened social tensions. Communities seeking explanations for their suffering found convenient scapegoats in alleged witches. Witch burning intensified during periods of hardship, notes Dr. Hartwick. When crops failed or disease spread, communities looked for someone to blame. Witches provided an explanation that maintained the belief, in a just world, suffering wasn't random but caused by malevolent individuals who could be identified and eliminated. Gender dynamics were central to witch burning. The Malleus Maleficarum explicitly connected witchcraft to feminine weakness. What else is woman but a foe to friendship? An unescapable punishment, a necessary evil, a natural temptation, a desirable calamity, a domestic danger, a delectable detriment, an evil of nature, painted with fair colours. This misogyny translated into disproportionate targeting of women, particularly those who in some way violated gender norms. The outspoken, the independent, midwives with knowledge of herbs and reproductive processes, women who lived alone or controlled property. Burning these women reasserted patriarchal control during a period of social change. The spectacle of witch burning served important social functions beyond punishment. Public executions reinforced community boundaries, demonstrated the power of authorities, and provided cathartic release for collective anxieties. Witnesses often collected ashes or charred remains from the pyre, believing they held protective powers against further witchcraft. As the scientific revolution progressed and Enlightenment thinking spread through Europe, witch burning gradually declined. Legal reforms raised standards of evidence, making convictions more difficult. Intellectual elites increasingly questioned the reality of witchcraft, viewing accusations as superstition rather than fact. Friedrich Spee, a Jesuit priest who served as confessor to condemned witches, published his Cautio Criminalis, 1631, anonymously, arguing that torture produced false confessions and that many innocent people were being executed. This and similar works gradually influenced legal authorities to approach witch accusations with greater scepticism. The last legal witch execution in Europe occurred in Switzerland in 1782, when Anna Göldi was beheaded, not burned, for allegedly poisoning a child. By this time, most European countries had abolished witch trials, though informal violence against suspected witches continued in some rural areas. The witch-burning era represents a crucial transition in the history of burning alive, a period when ancient fears of harmful magic combined with Christian theology, misogyny, and social stress to create systematic persecution. The flames that consumed alleged witches were seen not merely as punishment, but as purification, cleansing communities of perceived corruption while sending a powerful message about the consequences of deviation from established norms. Fire as public theatre. The date is May 30th, 1431. The marketplace of Rouen, France, has been transformed into a stage for one of history's most infamous burnings. 19-year-old Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, stands atop a pyre as officials read her sentence. Convicted of heresy and wearing male clothing, a crime that symbolised her defiance of gender norms and ecclesiastical authority, she faces the flames not just as an individual, but as a potent symbol in the ongoing struggle between French and English interests in the 100 Years' War. As the fire is lit, witnesses report that she calls out the name of Jesus repeatedly. The executioner is later troubled by his inability to destroy her heart in the flames. Within 25 years, the same church that condemned her will revisit her case and declare her innocent. Within 5 centuries, she will be canonised as a saint. Joan's burning exemplifies how fire executions functioned as elaborate public theatre, performances that communicated complex messages about power, transgression, and redemption to assembled audiences. These spectacles were carefully choreographed to maximise their impact on witnesses and to shape collective memory. Public executions were never simply about disposing of criminals, explains Dr. Michel Foucault, renowned historian of punishment systems. They were complex rituals through which political authority displayed itself and reinforced social boundaries. The staging of burning executions followed theatrical principles. Authorities selected locations with maximum visibility, typically market squares or spaces outside city gates. Scaffolds and stakes were constructed at elevated heights to ensure all could see. Executions were scheduled for market days or holidays when crowds would be largest. Some cities even constructed permanent execution grounds with stone platforms that could accommodate multiple stakes. The condemned's journey to the stake, what historians call the procession to punishment, constituted the first act of this grim theatre. In many regions, the convicted would be paraded through main streets, often wearing distinctive clothing or signs detailing their crimes. This procession served multiple purposes: public humiliation, opportunity for the community to witness justice, and time for the condemned to contemplate their fate and potentially show repentance. Jean Calas, a Protestant merchant executed in Toulouse in 1762, a case that would later inspire Voltaire's campaign against judicial torture, was forced to process barefoot, wearing only a shirt, with a candle in his hand. This ritualised humiliation emphasised his powerlessness before execution. Upon reaching the execution site, carefully prescribed rituals unfolded. Religious officials offered final opportunities for confession and repentance. Authorities read formal sentences, often recounting the condemned's crimes in detail. These procedural elements transformed killing into justice by embedding it within legal and religious frameworks. The physical arrangement of burning sites reinforced social hierarchies. Officials and elite witnesses occupied privileged viewing positions. Ordinary spectators arranged themselves according to status. The condemned occupied the central position, elevated for visibility, but symbolically separated from the community they had transgressed against. The burning stake created a kind of theatre in the round, notes Dr. Hartwick. Everyone could see, but your viewing position reflected your social standing. Authorities watched from windows or platforms. Common people pressed in from all sides. The architecture of execution reinforced the very social order that the condemned had violated. The behaviour of the condemned constituted the central drama of burning executions. How individuals faced the flames could transform the meaning of their deaths. Those who remained defiant, like the Czech reformer Jan Hus, who reportedly sang hymns as he burned in 1415, created powerful counter-narratives that sometimes inspired rather than deterred followers. Conversely, those who showed dramatic repentance reinforced official narratives about the justice of their punishment. Authorities particularly valued last-minute confessions that validated the entire judicial process. These confessions were sometimes published and distributed as pamphlets, extending the theatrical impact beyond those physically present. The sensory experience of burning executions was overwhelming by design. The crackling flames, the smell of burning flesh, the visual spectacle of fire consuming a human body, and sometimes the screams of the condemned created a multi-sensory impression that seared itself into witnesses' memories. Sebastian Castellio, a 16th century theologian who opposed burning heretics, described the impact. I have seen men shudder for months after, witnessing a burning, troubled by nightmares in which they smelled again what cannot be unsmelled. This sensory assault wasn't incidental, but central to burning's deterrent function. Authorities wanted witnesses to carry the experience in their bodies, to feel viscerally what awaited those who committed similar transgressions. The audience at burnings wasn't passive, but participated actively in the spectacle. Contemporary accounts describe crowds jeering, throwing additional fuel onto pyres, or occasionally attempting to hasten the condemned's death as an act of mercy. In some regions, spectators collected souvenirs, ashes, bone fragments, or pieces of the stake, believing they held magical or medicinal properties. The theatrical elements of burning reached their apex in the Spanish and Portuguese autos da fe, acts of faith, elaborate religious ceremonies culminating in the burning of heretics and relapsed converts. These events could last an entire day, beginning with processions and religious services before concluding with executions. A particularly large auto da fe, held in Madrid in 1680 in the Plaza Maya, attended by King Charles II and Queen Marie-Louise, featured multiple stages, seating for thousands of spectators and elaborate decorations, with a procession, and didn't conclude until 9 p.m, when the condemned were finally led outside the city to the Quemadero burning place. The theatrical nature of burning extended beyond the execution itself through textual and visual representations. Authorities published accounts of executions, often including the condemned's confession and expressions of repentance. Broadsheets and pamphlets featuring woodcut illustrations circulated widely, allowing those not physically present to participate vicariously in the spectacle. These representations often emphasized the didactic purpose of burning. A typical broadsheet might show the condemned surrounded by demons, representing their crimes, while angels waited above, representing the possibility of redemption through confession. Text would detail the specific transgressions, the legal process, and the condemned's final words, usually crafted to emphasize the justice of their punishment. The public nature of burning served crucial social functions. It transformed abstract legal principles into visceral reality, demonstrating that justice was being served. It reinforced community boundaries by literally removing transgressors. It provided emotional catharsis for communities dealing with the anxiety produced by perceived threats like witchcraft or heresy. Public burnings were a form of social exorcism, explains Dr. Coleman. They allowed communities to physically cast out elements they perceived as dangerous or polluting, creating a shared experience that reinforced collective identity against a defined other. As the early modern period progressed, attitudes toward public burning gradually shifted. Enlightenment thinkers increasingly criticized public executions as barbaric spectacles that brutalized spectators rather than deterring crime. Cesare Beccaria's influential On Crimes and Punishments, 1764, argued that the certainty of punishment, not its severity or theatricality, most effectively prevented crime. By the late 18th century, burning had largely disappeared from European judicial systems, though other public executions continued. When executions moved behind prison walls in the 19th century, the theatrical element diminished but didn't disappear entirely. It simply transformed into textual representations in newspapers and later electronic media. The theatrical aspects of burning reveal how execution by fire was never merely about killing offenders, but about communicating complex messages about power, transgression, and redemption. The flames that consumed human bodies also illuminated social boundaries, religious orthodoxies, and political authorities, creating spectacles designed to be remembered long after the ashes cooled. As we explore these historical burning executions, I invite you to consider: why have humans throughout history been drawn to witness public executions? What psychological needs did these spectacles fulfill for spectators? And what does our modern discomfort with public execution reveal about how our sensibilities have changed, or haven't changed, over centuries? The fascination with witnessing suffering has deep psychological roots that connect our ancestors to modern true crime enthusiasts. Consider your own reactions to the descriptions in this video. Do you feel repulsion, fascination, or perhaps both simultaneously? This ambivalence itself has historical parallels. Many execution witnesses reported both attraction and horror at what they observed. Case studies of infamous burnings. Throughout history, Certain burning executions transcended their immediate circumstances to become symbolic events with far-reaching consequences. These infamous cases reveal how fire punishment could transform victims into martyrs, catalyse social movements, or serve as turning points in broader historical narratives. Let us examine several of these landmark burnings that continue to resonate centuries later. Jacques de Molay, 1314. The last Templar Grand Master. The flames rose high on the small island in the Seine River as Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, faced his death on March 18, 1314. After 7 years of imprisonment, torture, and forced confessions, de Molay had publicly recanted his confession, declaring the Templars innocent of the heresy, sodomy, and idol worship charges brought against them by King Philip IV of France. This recantation sealed his fate. That evening, on a scaffold erected on the Île des Juifs, near Notre Dame Cathedral, de Molay and Geoffrey de Charnay, preceptor of Normandy, were slowly roasted over a small fire, a method designed to prolong suffering. According to chronicler Geoffrey of Paris, who witnessed the execution, de Molay requested to be faced toward Notre Dame Cathedral and to have his hands freed so he could die in prayer. From the flames, he allegedly proclaimed, "God knows who is wrong and has sinned. Soon a calamity will occur to those who have condemned us to death." The execution had been orchestrated by King Philip IV, who had engineered the destruction of the wealthy and powerful Templar order to seize their assets and eliminate a potential threat to his authority. Pope Clement V, pressured by Philip, had dissolved the order in 1312. De Molay's death transformed him from a disgraced religious leader into a martyr figure. When both King Philip and Pope Clement died within the year, many viewed it as fulfilment of de Molay's curse. The dramatic burning became embedded in cultural memory, inspiring centuries of Templar legends, conspiracy theories, and eventually Masonic rituals that claim connection to the executed Grand Master. De Molay's burning represents how fire could backfire as a method of eliminating enemies, explains Dr. Coleman. Rather than erasing the Templars from history, the flames paradoxically ensured their immortality in European cultural memory. Jan Hus, 1415. The Bohemian Reformer. On July 6, 1415, Czech theologian Jan Hus stood atop a pyre at the Council of Constance, wearing a paper hat painted with demons and inscribed with the word heresiarch, leader of heretics. He had spent months defending his reformist views before the council, refusing to recant his criticisms of church corruption and his belief that scripture, not papal authority, should be Christianity's ultimate guide. After being stripped of his priestly vestments and handed to secular authorities, Hus was led to his execution. According to witnesses, when a final opportunity to recant was offered, Hus replied, "God is my witness that I have never taught or preached that, which false witnesses have testified against me. In the truth of the gospel which I have written, taught, and preached, I will die today with gladness." As the flames rose, Hus reportedly began singing liturgical hymns until the smoke and fire choked his voice. When some peasants threw additional wood on the fire, he is said to have exclaimed, "O sancta simplicitas," "O holy simplicity," not condemning but pitying their participation in his death. Authorities took extraordinary measures to prevent Hus's remains from becoming relics. They broke apart his charred bones, scraped up the ashes, and cast everything into the Rhine River. Despite these efforts, Hus's burning transformed him into a national hero and religious martyr, whose death sparked the Hussite Wars, 1419 to 1434, when his followers in Bohemia revolted against Catholic authority. A century later, Martin Luther would recognise Hus as a predecessor to his own reform movement, writing, "We have all been Hussites without knowing it." The burning intended to eliminate Hus's influence instead amplified it, demonstrating fire's paradoxical power to elevate rather than erase its victims. Joan of Arc, 1431. The Maid of Orleans. Perhaps no burning is more famous than that of Joan of Arc, the 19-year-old peasant girl who led French forces to crucial victories in the 100 Years' War, was captured by Burgundian allies of the English in 1430 and subjected to an ecclesiastical trial designed to discredit both her and the French king she had helped crown. After months of interrogation focusing on her male attire, claims of divine voices, and refusal to submit to church authority, Joan was condemned as a heretic and relapsed sinner. On May 30th, 1431, in Rouen marketplace she faced burning with remarkable courage. Eyewitness accounts describe how she requested a cross be held before her as the flames rose. She repeatedly called out "Jesus" as the fire consumed her. The English executioner, Geoffroy Terrage, later reported being troubled by his inability to burn her heart to ashes despite multiple attempts. Joan's burning was intended to brand her as a heretic and witch, delegitimizing the French King Charles VII, whom she had helped crown. Instead, it transformed her into a powerful symbol of French national identity, and eventually a Catholic saint. 25 years after her execution, a nullification trial reversed her conviction, declaring her innocent of the charges. In 1920, nearly 5 centuries after her burning, she was canonized by the same church that had condemned her. Joan's case demonstrates how burning could transform victims into symbols that transcended their historical moment, notes Dr. Hartwick. The flames that were meant to erase her instead illuminated her for centuries to come. Giordano Bruno, 650, the cosmic philosopher. After 7 years of imprisonment and interrogation by the Roman Inquisition, philosopher Giordano Bruno was led to Rome's Campo de' Fiori on February 17, 1600. His crimes included holding heretical cosmic views, including belief in an infinite universe with multiple worlds, questioning core Catholic doctrines, and practicing hermetic magic. Unlike many heretics who recanted under torture, Bruno remained defiant. When his death sentence was pronounced, he allegedly told his judges, "Perhaps you pronounce this sentence against me with greater fear than I receive it." At the stake, Bruno refused the crucifix offered to him, turning his face away. This final defiance ensured he would face the full horror of the flames without the mercy of strangulation beforehand. Contemporary accounts describe how his tongue was restrained to prevent him from addressing the crowd. Bruno's burning came at a pivotal moment in European intellectual history, during the transition from Renaissance to scientific revolution. While his cosmic theories, including the infinity of the universe and plurality of worlds, were based more on philosophical and mystical grounds than empirical evidence, they anticipated later scientific discoveries. In the centuries following his execution, Bruno was transformed from obscure heretic to martyr for scientific freedom and intellectual inquiry. In 1889, a statue of Bruno was erected at the site of his burning, where it stands today as a reminder of the conflict between dogma and free thought. Bruno's burning represents the attempt to contain dangerous ideas through fire, explains Dr. Coleman. But ideas, unlike bodies, cannot be reduced to ashes. Urbain Grandier, 1634, the priest of Loudun. The case of Urbain Grandier stands as one of history's most notorious political burnings, disguised as religious justice. Grandier, a charismatic priest in Loudun, France, had made powerful enemies through his opposition to Cardinal Richelieu's policies and his scandalous personal life that violated his vow of celibacy. When the Ursuline nuns of Loudun began experiencing convulsions and claiming demonic possession, Grandier became the focus of accusations. Despite initial acquittal, a second trial orchestrated by one of Richelieu's agents resulted in Grandier's conviction for making a pact with the devil and causing the nuns possession. On August 18, 1634, Grandier was subjected to extreme torture before being led to the stake. His legs were crushed in a device called the boots, splintering his bones. When offered mercy through strangulation before burning, Grandier was denied this customary relief when executioners tied the cord in a way that provided no quick death. Witnesses described how Grandier remained conscious as the flames consumed him, praying continuously until smoke inhalation finally ended his suffering. The Loudun possession case would later inspire numerous literary and dramatic works, including Aldous Huxley's The Devils of Loudun and Ken Russell's controversial film The Devils. Grandier's case illustrates how burning could serve as a tool of political elimination disguised as religious purification. While ostensibly punished for sorcery and demonic pacts, historical analysis suggests Grandier was eliminated for his political opposition to Richelieu's centralisation of French power. Catherine Monvoisin, 1680. La Voisin and the Affair of the Poisons. On February 22, 1680, Catherine Monvoisin, known as La Voisin, was burned alive at the Place de Grève in Paris, bringing a spectacular end to one of France's most sensational criminal cases. As Paris's most prominent fortune-teller and purveyor of potions, La Voisin had built a clientele that included members of King Louis XIV's court. The investigation into her activities, known as the Affair of the Poisons, revealed a network of fortune-tellers, alchemists and priests who provided love potions, poisons, and even sacrificial ceremonies to aristocratic clients. Most shocking were allegations that La Voisin had conducted black masses, where priests performed sacrilegious rituals over naked women's bodies and sacrificed infants. La Voisin's burning was exceptional even by the standards of the time. Authorities denied her the mercy of preliminary strangulation, ensuring she experienced the full agony of the flames. Contemporary accounts describe how she kicked away the straw and kindling at her feet several times before the executioners managed to secure her and light the pyre. The investigation threatened to implicate the king's mistress and other high-ranking nobles, prompting Louis XIV to eventually halt the proceedings and seal the records. La Voisin's burning thus served dual purposes, eliminating a dangerous criminal while also cauterising a scandal that threatened the monarchy itself. La Voisin's case shows how burning could serve as a spectacular full stop to threatening narratives, notes Dr. Hartwick. The flames consumed not just her body, but potentially the entire scandal she might have revealed. These case studies reveal how burning executions, intended to eliminate individuals and the ideas or influences they represented, often achieved the opposite effect. The flames that consumed bodies frequently illuminated legacies, transforming victims into martyrs whose influence expanded rather than diminished after death. Each infamous burning became a cultural reference point that transcended its immediate historical context. Jacques de Molay's execution spawned centuries of Templar mythology. Jan Hus's burning ignited the Hussite Revolution. Joan of Arc's flames forged a national symbol. Giordano Bruno's pyre illuminated the conflict between dogma and scientific inquiry. Urbain Grandier's suffering exposed the intersection of religion and political power. La Voisin's execution both concluded and concealed a royal scandal. These cases demonstrate fire's paradoxical power, its capacity to destroy bodies while simultaneously creating enduring symbols. The very spectacle designed to erase instead ensured remembrance, proving that some flames once lit can never truly be extinguished. Psychological and symbolic impact. The crackling of flames, the acrid smell of smoke, the rising heat against skin. Long before actual burning begins, these sensory experiences trigger primal fear responses in the human brain. Our evolutionary history has hardwired us to fear fire, a fear that burning executions weaponized with terrible efficiency. The psychological and symbolic dimensions of burning alive extend far beyond physical pain, reaching into realms of existential terror that few other execution methods could match. Fire affects us on multiple psychological levels simultaneously, explains Dr. Sarah Reinhardt, forensic psychologist specialising in historical trauma. It triggers primitive survival circuits while also engaging complex symbolic associations with purification, transformation, and spiritual judgment. This multi-layered impact made burning uniquely terrifying across cultures. The physical suffering of burning alive was horrific by any standard. Modern medical understanding reveals what victims experienced as flames consumed their bodies. Initially, intense pain erupts as fire damages nerve endings in the skin. As burning progresses, nerve damage can actually reduce pain temporarily, a cruel mercy followed by renewed agony as deeper tissues become involved. Death during burning typically results from a combination of factors: carbon monoxide poisoning from smoke inhalation, shock from fluid loss, heat stroke, and eventually direct damage to vital organs. The process could take anywhere from 15 minutes to over an hour, depending on wind conditions, the construction of the pyre, and whether mercy measures like strangulation were employed beforehand. Eyewitness accounts from executions describe victims' desperate attempts to find positions that might minimise their suffering, turning away from flames, trying to inhale smoke quickly to hasten unconsciousness, or begging executioners for mercy. These accounts reveal the profound psychological torture that accompanied the physical pain. Beyond physical suffering, burning inflicted unique psychological torments on its victims. Unlike beheading or hanging, which could be relatively quick, burning confronted the condemned with the anticipation of prolonged agony. This anticipatory dread, watching the pyre being built, feeling the first waves of heat, smelling the smoke, constituted a form of psychological torture that began long before flames touched flesh. The mind's ability to anticipate suffering can be as torturous as the suffering itself, notes Dr. Reinhardt. Victims of burning experienced what psychologists call anticipatory pain, their brains activating pain centres before physical damage occurred, based solely on the expectation of what was to come. This anticipatory suffering was deliberately enhanced by execution protocols. In many jurisdictions, the condemned were forced to watch the construction of their pyres. They might be held nearby as crowds gathered and officials made preparations. Every moment extended the psychological torture, creating what modern trauma specialists would recognise as acute stress response, the body flooding with stress hormones hours before the actual burning began. The symbolic dimensions of burning were equally significant in their psychological impact. Across cultures, fire represented transformation and purification. By applying these symbolic associations to human execution, authorities tapped into deep archetypal meanings that resonated with witnesses and victims alike. For Christians facing burning, the flames evoked immediate associations with hellfire, the eternal punishment awaiting the damned. This connection was often explicitly made by officials who would tell the condemned that their earthly burning was merely a preview of eternal torments to come unless they repented. Conversely, for those who maintained their innocence or held fast to condemned beliefs, fire could evoke martyrdom symbolism, testing and proving the purity of their faith. Early Christian martyrs had established this symbolic framework, with accounts describing how they remained miraculously serene amidst flames, their faith burning brighter than the fires consuming their bodies. The transformative symbolism of fire carried particular significance in execution contexts. Unlike other execution methods that left corpses intact, burning literally transformed the human body into something else: ash and smoke. This physical transformation paralleled the social transformation of the condemned from community member to eliminated transgressor. Burning didn't just kill, it unmade, explains Dr. Coleman. It transformed a person from a recognisable human into elemental components, ash returning to earth, smoke rising to sky. This complete transformation satisfied deep psychological needs for communities dealing with perceived pollution or corruption in their midst. The public nature of burning amplified its psychological impact on both victims and communities. Being burned meant dying not just in pain, but in spectacle. One's final moments witnessed by crowds whose reactions might range from solemn observation to active jeering. This public dimension added shame and humiliation to physical suffering. For communities, Witnessing burnings created collective psychological experiences that reinforced social boundaries. The shared witnessing of extreme punishment created what sociologists call boundary maintenance, clarifying who belonged within the community and what happened to those who transgressed its norms. Historical accounts suggest that communities often experienced complex psychological responses to burnings. Initial satisfaction at seeing justice served could give way to unease or guilt, particularly when victims showed courage or maintained dignity in the flames. This ambivalence sometimes appears in contemporary accounts that express admiration for victims' fortitude, even while approving their punishment. The psychological impact extended beyond the execution itself through what we would now recognise as trauma responses. Nightmares, intrusive memories, and anxiety affected not just victims who survived initial burning attempts, but also witnesses. Executioners particularly reported psychological distress, with some seeking religious absolution or developing rituals to manage their participation in burnings. Jean Taffin, a French executioner active in the late 16th century, reportedly refused to burn witches unless they were strangled first, claiming that these screams followed him into sleep. Other executioners developed alcoholism or left their professions after particularly disturbing burnings. These responses suggest recognition of burning's unique psychological brutality, even among those tasked with implementing it. For condemned individuals from cultures with specific beliefs about proper death and afterlife, like the Vikings, burning carried additional psychological terrors. The Vikings' particular horror of burning stemmed from its disruption of proper funeral practices and its implications for the afterlife journey. Viking cosmology required specific treatment of the body after death, explains Dr. Thorvaldsen. While cremation was an accepted funeral practice, it occurred after a proper death with appropriate rituals. Burning alive collapsed death and cremation into a single event, disrupting the necessary sequence for a proper afterlife journey. For Vikings, burning also threatened their concept of good death, ideally occurring in battle or with dignity, allowing the dying person to speak memorable last words. Burning denied this cultural script, replacing dignified last words with screams of agony. This disruption of cultural death norms created existential terror beyond physical suffering. The psychological impact of burning varied across cultures and historical periods, reflecting different beliefs about death, afterlife, and the body. For medieval Christians, burning might represent purgatorial suffering that could cleanse sin. For Jews facing burning during persecutions, it evoked both historical trauma, the destruction of the temple, and martyrdom traditions of Kiddush Hashem, sanctification of God's name through death rather than conversion. Modern psychological understanding suggests that burning represented a perfect storm of traumatic elements: extreme physical pain, prolonged duration, public humiliation, anticipatory dread, and profound symbolic meaning. This combination made it uniquely effective as both punishment and deterrent. From a psychological perspective, burning activated every fear centre in the human brain, notes Dr. Reinhardt. Physical pain pathways, social rejection networks, existential anxiety, all triggered simultaneously by this single method of execution. As societies gradually moved away from burning in the 18th and 19th centuries, the psychological understanding of punishment also shifted. Enlightenment thinkers increasingly argued that deterrence depended not on the spectacle of suffering, but on the certainty of consequences. The psychological trauma inflicted on communities by public burnings began to be recognised as counterproductive, brutalising witnesses rather than reinforcing moral boundaries. The psychological and symbolic dimensions of burning help explain both its persistence across cultures and its eventual abandonment. No other execution method combined such extreme physical suffering with such rich symbolic associations and psychological impacts. This combination made burning uniquely effective as a tool of both religious and secular authorities, and uniquely horrifying to its victims. including the stoic Vikings who faced most other deaths with remarkable courage. Why Vikings feared it. The longship cuts through fog-shrouded waters, its crew of hardened warriors preparing for battle. These are men who have raided distant shores, who have faced death countless times with weapons in hand. They fear neither blade nor arrow. They welcome the opportunity for a glorious end that might carry them to Valhalla. Yet among these battle-hardened Norsemen, one fate looms as a terror beyond all others: to be taken alive and burned at the stake. What made burning so uniquely horrifying to a culture that otherwise glorified violent death? The answer lies at the intersection of Norse cosmology, social structures, and concepts of honourable death, revealing how burning threatened not just the body but the very foundation of Viking identity and afterlife hopes. The Vikings' particular horror of burning cannot be understood without recognising their complex beliefs about proper death and remembrance, explains Dr. Thorvaldsen. For a culture that celebrated warrior deaths, their specific fear of burning reveals profound concerns about spiritual and social erasure. To comprehend this fear, we must first understand the Norse conceptualization of death and afterlife. Unlike the Christian binary of heaven and hell, Norse cosmology offered multiple afterlife destinations. Warriors who died bravely in battle might be selected by Valkyries for Odin's Hall of Valhalla, where they would feast and fight until Ragnarok. Others might join the goddess Freyja in Folkvanga. Those who died of disease or old age would generally travel to Helheim, neither paradise nor punishment, but simply the realm of the dead. Crucially, the manner of death significantly influenced afterlife destination. A weapon death, particularly in battle, opened the possibility of Valhalla. Other deaths led to different realms, but all proper deaths shared certain characteristics. They allowed for appropriate funeral rites, maintained bodily integrity until those rites could be performed, and provided the opportunity for the dying person to demonstrate courage. Viking funeral practices varied regionally and evolved over time. Some communities practiced inhumation, burial, while others practiced cremation. Ship burials were reserved for elites, but all these practices shared a crucial feature: death preceded funeral treatment. The community gathered around the already deceased, performed appropriate rituals, and sent the dead properly to the afterlife. Burning alive disrupted this essential sequence. It collapsed death and cremation into a single event, denying the community's role in proper transition. It transformed what should have been a respectful post-death treatment into the mechanism of suffering itself. For Vikings, cremation was an honourable funeral practice when performed correctly, notes Dr. Larsen. But burning alive perverted this practice into something horrific, using sacred fire not to honour the dead, but to cause death through extreme suffering. Beyond disrupting funeral practices, burning denied the opportunity for a good death by Viking standards. Norse culture placed enormous emphasis on how one faced death. The sagas are filled with accounts of dying warriors delivering memorable final words or showing remarkable stoicism in their final moments. The Havamal, a collection of Old Norse poems attributed to Odin, explicitly addresses proper death. Cattle die, kindred die, every man is mortal, but the good name never dies of one who has done well. Burning denied this cultural script entirely. Instead of facing death with dignity and memorable words, the burned died screaming in agony, their final expressions being pain rather than wisdom or courage. This undermined the Viking emphasis on maintaining honour even, perhaps especially, in death. The social dimensions of burning were equally significant in Viking horror. Norse society was fundamentally organised around concepts of honour and reputation. An individual's worth continued after death through remembrance, in skaldic poetry, saga accounts, and the oral traditions that kept ancestors present in community memory. Burning threatened this social afterlife. The spectacular nature of the death by fire could overshadow all previous deeds, replacing a life's accomplishments with the single memory of an agonising, dishonourable end. Rather than being remembered for courage in battle or wisdom in council, the burned would be remembered only for their screams. The Vikings feared not just physical death, but social death, explains Dr. Thorvaldsen. To be forgotten or remembered wrongly was a fate worse than simple mortality. Burning threatened to replace all other memories with a single image of an agonising, shameful end. Archaeological evidence supports the special status of burning in Norse culture. While execution sites have been excavated showing evidence of hanging, beheading and other methods, burning appears more rarely and in specific contexts, typically associated with accusations of nidingsverk, particularly shameful deeds, or cider, harmful sorcery. The Oseberg ship burial, one of the most spectacular Viking archaeological finds, reveals the proper treatment of the dead, even when cremation was employed. The careful arrangement of grave goods, the elaborate ritual elements, and the community investment in the funeral process stand in stark contrast to the hasty, punitive nature of execution by burning. The Vikings' particular horror of burning is further illuminated by examining their other execution methods. The infamous blood eagle, splitting the ribs from the spine and pulling the lungs outward to form wings, was undeniably agonising. Drowning in bogs, another Viking punishment, was terrifying. Yet neither carried the same level of dread as burning. The difference lies in what each method meant for the afterlife journey and remembrance. Even brutal executions like the blood eagle maintained bodily integrity in ways that permitted proper funeral treatment afterward. The executed might not reach Valhalla, but they could still be properly sent to an afterlife through community rituals. Burning, in contrast, destroyed the body during the execution itself, leaving nothing but ashes for funeral treatment. This physical erasure paralleled the social and spiritual erasure that Vikings particularly feared. The Norse concept of soul or self was more complex than the Christian notion of an immortal soul separate from the body. The Norse understood humans to have multiple spiritual components: the hammer, shape or skin; the huga, mind, thought; the fylgja, a kind of guardian spirit; and others. The proper transition of these spiritual elements after death required specific treatment of the body. Viking concepts of selfhood didn't neatly separate body and soul, notes Dr. Thorvaldsen. The treatment of the physical remains directly affected spiritual elements. Burning alive disrupted the proper separation and transition of these components. Literary evidence from the sagas repeatedly demonstrates the special horror of burning. In Njal's saga, when Flosi and his men surround Njal's home and set it ablaze with the family inside, the act is presented as particularly dishonourable, a nidingsverk that will stain the perpetrators regardless of their grievances. When Njal's young grandson asks, "Grandfather, are they going to burn us?" the question carries special horror. Njal replies with stoic acceptance, "They will burn my body, but my spirit they cannot burn." This response highlights the Viking understanding that while fire could destroy the physical form, proper facing of death could still preserve something of the self. The saga's treatment of the aftermath further reveals burning's special status. The community is horrified not just by the killings, but specifically by the method. The collecting of the burned remains for proper burial becomes a crucial act of restoration, an attempt to provide some semblance of proper funeral treatment after an improper death. Comparing Viking attitudes toward burning with those of their contemporaries further illuminates their particular horror. While medieval Christians also feared burning, their fear centred on different aspects: the association with hellfire and eternal punishment. For Christians, burning foreshadowed potential afterlife torments. For Vikings, the terror was not about what burning symbolised, but what it actually did, disrupting proper death processes, denying appropriate funeral treatments, and threatening remembrance. Their horror was practical and immediate rather than symbolic and eschatological. As Christianity gradually spread through Scandinavia from the 9th through 12th centuries, attitudes toward burning shifted. Christian concepts of hellfire added new dimensions to the existing Norse horror of burning. The physical destruction of burning became linked to spiritual destruction in ways that intensified its terror. The Christianization process created a syncretic understanding of burning, explains Dr. Larson. Traditional Norse concerns about proper death and remembrance merged with Christian fears of burning as divine punishment, creating a particularly potent horror. This syncretic horror appears in later Norse literature, where burning becomes increasingly associated with both traditional concerns about remembrance and newer Christian concerns about salvation. The layering of these fears created a particularly potent dread that would persist through the medieval period. The Vikings' particular fear of burning reveals something profound about human responses to execution methods. While all cultures fear painful death, the specific horrors that resonate most deeply are those that threaten not just physical existence, but cultural values and identity. For the Vikings, burning represented not just physical agony, but spiritual and social erasure, the antithesis of everything their culture valued about proper death. This understanding helps explain why even warriors who faced battle unflinchingly might tremble at the prospect of burning. Their fear wasn't simply of pain, but of a death that undermined their entire cultural framework, a truly fate worse than death by their specific cultural standards. Decline of the burning stake. Paris, April 1757. A crowd of thousands has gathered in the Place de Grève to witness the execution of Robert-François Damiens, who had attempted to assassinate King Louis XV. The punishment is extraordinarily severe, even by 18th century standards. Damiens is subjected to torture with red-hot pincers, his hand burned with sulphur, molten lead and boiling oil poured into his wounds, and finally his body drawn and quartered by horses. When the horses fail to tear his limbs apart, executioners cut his joints with axes to assist the dismemberment. Among the horrified spectators is a young lawyer named Cesare Beccaria, who will later write in his influential treatise On Crimes and Punishments, 1764. The severity of punishment itself emboldens men to commit the very wrongs it is supposed to prevent. The certainty of punishment, even if moderate, will always make a stronger impression than the fear of a more terrible punishment that is united with the hope of impunity. Damiens' execution, described in excruciating detail by witnesses including Casanova and famously analysed by Michel Foucault in Discipline and Punish, represents the spectacular last gasp of a punishment system that was already beginning to crumble under Enlightenment criticism. Within decades, burning alive would largely disappear from European judicial systems, marking one of history's most significant shifts in punishment philosophy. The decline of burning as a judicial punishment occurred gradually across Europe from the mid-18th through early 19th centuries, driven by intersecting intellectual, political, and social factors. This transition wasn't merely a softening of punishments, but represented a fundamental reconceptualization of the purpose of justice itself. The movement away from burning reflects a profound shift in how European societies understood the relationship between the state, the criminal, and the public, explains Dr. Coleman. It wasn't simply humanitarian concern, but a complete rethinking of what punishment was meant to accomplish. The intellectual foundations for this shift emerged from Enlightenment thinking about proportionality, deterrence, and the proper limits of state power. Philosophers including Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Beccaria challenged traditional justifications for severe punishments, arguing that justice should aim at prevention rather than retribution, and that punishments should be proportional to crimes. Beccaria's On Crimes and Punishments provided the most systematic critique, arguing that the purpose of punishment is neither to torment and afflict a sensitive being, nor to undo a crime already committed. The purpose can only be to prevent the criminal from inflicting new injuries on citizens and to deter others from similar acts. This utilitarian approach directly challenged the theatrical aspects of burning alive. If deterrence depended on certainty rather than severity, the spectacular suffering of burning served no practical purpose. Beccaria and his contemporaries argued that moderate, predictable punishments would more effectively prevent crime than occasional spectacular horrors. Voltaire's campaign against judicial abuses, particularly following the wrongful execution of Jean Calas in 1762, highlighted burning's potential for irreversible miscarriage of justice. Calas, a Protestant merchant, was tortured and executed for allegedly murdering his son to prevent his conversion to Catholicism. Voltaire's investigation revealed that the son had likely committed suicide, making Calas's torture and execution a tragic error that could never be remedied. The philosophical critiques gained practical traction through political reforms. Frederick the Great of Prussia abolished torture in 1740 and restricted capital punishment. Grand Duke Leopold of Tuscany, later Emperor Leopold II, abolished the death penalty entirely in Tuscany in 1786, the first European state to do so. The French revolutionary government, despite its own use of the guillotine, reformed the penal code to eliminate burning and other torture executions in 1791. These political reforms reflected changing understandings of state legitimacy. As monarchies based on divine right gave way to more contractual conceptions of government, the spectacular violence of burning, which had demonstrated the sovereign's power over subjects' bodies, became increasingly problematic. Modern states derived legitimacy not from displays of terrible power, but from rational administration of justice. The decline of burning parallels the transition from bodies to minds as the primary targets of state power, notes Dr. Coleman, echoing Foucault's analysis. Modern states didn't need to destroy bodies spectacularly. They developed more subtle methods of controlling populations through surveillance, classification, and correction. Social and cultural factors also contributed to burning's decline. The growing middle class developed new sensibilities regarding public violence. What had once been acceptable public spectacle became increasingly viewed as barbaric and brutalising to spectators. Burning executions, with their extended suffering and sensory assault, became particularly problematic for these evolving sensibilities. Medical and scientific developments undermined burning's theological justifications. As understanding of human physiology improved, the extreme suffering of burning became harder to reconcile with concepts of justice or divine punishment. Medical professionals increasingly spoke against burning on humanitarian grounds, describing in clinical terms the stages of suffering that victims experienced. Dr. Antoine Louis, a French surgeon who would later design the prototype for the guillotine, wrote in 1788, "The suffering of burning progresses through stages of increasing agony that no crime could possibly justify. Medicine cannot remain silent when such torture is inflicted in the name of justice." Religious thinking itself evolved regarding appropriate punishments. While burning had been justified through biblical passages about purification by fire, religious reformers increasingly emphasized mercy and rehabilitation. By the late 18th century, many religious authorities had joined secular voices in opposing burning as excessive and unchristian. The actual process of abolishing burning varied significantly across Europe. In England, burning of women for treason, specifically killing one's husband, was abolished in 1790, replacing it with hanging. France eliminated burning through the revolutionary penal reforms of 1791. The Holy Roman Empire territories gradually abolished burning between 1750 and 1815, with Bavaria being among the last to eliminate it. Spain and Portugal maintained burning for certain religious offences longer than northern European countries, with the last auto da fe involving actual burning occurring in 1781 in Seville. The Spanish Inquisition was abolished in 1834, definitively ending the legal possibility of burning for heresy in Western Europe. Eastern European countries followed similar patterns, though sometimes with later timelines. Russia formally abolished burning in the early 19th century, though it had become rare much earlier. The Ottoman Empire which had occasionally used burning for certain offences, eliminated it during the Tanzimat reform period, 1839 to 1876. The transition away from burning wasn't simply elimination, but replacement. New execution methods emerged that aligned with Enlightenment principles of rational, humane punishment. The guillotine, introduced during the French Revolution, exemplified this new approach, quick, consistent, and theoretically painless, focusing on death rather than suffering. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin, advocating for the machine that would later bear his name, argued in 1789, "The criminal shall suffer nothing but the simple privation of life, which shall be accompanied by neither torture nor ignominy." This philosophy directly contradicted burning's emphasis on both suffering and shame. As burning disappeared from judicial systems, it remained in cultural memory as the epitome of cruel punishment. Literature, art, and later film continued to depict burning as the most terrible fate imaginable. This cultural persistence reveals how thoroughly burning had embedded itself in European consciousness as the ultimate punishment, a status it maintained even after its actual practice had ceased. The elimination of judicial burning represents one of history's most significant humanitarian advances, removing what had been for centuries the most dreaded punishment in Western legal systems. Yet this progress wasn't linear or universal. Extrajudicial burnings continued in some regions, particularly in the form of lynchings in the American South, where burning African Americans alive occurred well into the 20th century. Moreover, the 20th century would see the return of mass burning in new contexts, from the firebombing of cities during World War II to the crematoriums of Nazi death camps. These modern horrors employed industrial technology rather than public stakes, but they connected to the same ancient human understanding of fire's terrible power to consume not just bodies, but identities. The decline of judicial burning thus represents not a simple story of progress, but a complex transformation in how societies conceptualize justice, suffering, and state power. The flames that had illuminated medieval and early modern town squares were extinguished, but the deep human understanding of fire's terrible potential, the very understanding that had made burning so effective as punishment, would resurface in new and equally terrible forms in the modern era. We began our journey at the burning stake, witnessing the terrible spectacle that even the Vikings, those masters of violence and stoic death, found uniquely terrifying. Through centuries and across cultures, we've traced fire's transformation from sacred element to ultimate punishment, examining how the flames that gave humanity its first technological mastery became our most dreaded instrument of execution. The story of burning alive is more than a catalogue of historical horrors. It reveals profound truths about human psychology, cultural values, and the evolution of justice systems. In the Vikings' particular horror of burning, we discovered a culture that feared not just physical pain, but spiritual and social erasure. The obliteration of identity and remembrance that fire uniquely threatened. From ancient Babylonian law codes to medieval European town squares, from witch hunts to heresy trials, burning served purposes beyond mere punishment. It purified communities through the elimination of perceived corruption. It communicated complex messages about power and transgression through theatrical spectacle. It transformed abstract theological concepts into visceral reality through the suffering of human bodies. Execution by burning represents the intersection of practical punishment and profound symbolism, reflects Dr. Coleman. No other execution method combined such terrible physical reality with such rich cultural meanings. The psychological impact of burning, combining extreme physical pain, public humiliation, and symbolic erasure, made it uniquely effective as both punishment and deterrent. Yet this very effectiveness eventually contributed to its decline, as Enlightenment thinkers recognised that justice systems built on spectacular suffering ultimately undermined rather than strengthened social order. The gradual elimination of judicial burning across Europe during the 18th and early 19th centuries marked a fundamental shift in how societies understood the purpose of punishment. The flames that had illuminated medieval justice gave way to more rational methods focused on death rather than suffering, on reformation rather than spectacular elimination. Yet even as burning disappeared from formal judicial systems, it remained embedded in cultural consciousness as the ultimate punishment, a status it maintains even today. Modern audiences still recognise burning as representing the extreme limit of human cruelty, a boundary case that tests our concepts of justice and humanity. This persistent horror connects us directly to our ancestors, to the Vikings who feared burning beyond all other deaths, to the medieval witnesses who gathered in town squares, to the Enlightenment philosophers who finally recognised that justice need not be written in flames. Across centuries and cultures, the human response to fire's terrible power remains remarkably consistent. Perhaps most significantly, the history of burning alive reminds us that justice systems reflect deeper cultural values and anxieties. The Vikings feared burning because it threatened their concepts of honourable death and remembrance. Medieval Christians employed burning because it aligned with their understanding of sin and purification. Enlightenment reformers eliminated burning because it contradicted their vision of rational governance and proportional justice. As we contemplate this history from our modern perspective, we might ask what our own punishment systems reveal about our values and fears. What do our prisons, our death chambers, our systems of surveillance and control say about what we believe justice to be? What anxieties do they address, and what cultural scripts do they fulfill? The stakes no longer burn in our town squares, but the questions that burning forced communities to confront remain essential. How do societies respond to transgression? What limits should constrain punishment? What does justice require, and what does humanity forbid? These questions have no simple answers, but in studying how past societies addressed them, even through methods we now recognise as cruel, we gain perspective on our own struggles with justice and punishment. The history of burning alive, terrible as it is, offers a mirror in which we might examine our own assumptions about crime, punishment, and the proper limits of state power. As we conclude this exploration, we return to where we began, with the recognition that even for the Vikings, a culture immersed in violence and prepared for bloody death, the burning stake represented a horror beyond imagining. In understanding their specific fear, we've illuminated not just a historical curiosity, but a profound truth about human values across time. That beyond physical pain, what we truly fear is erasure, the destruction not just of body, but of identity and remembrance. The flames that consumed bodies on medieval pyres have long been extinguished, but their light still illuminates our understanding of justice, cruelty, and the complex relationship between punishment and the societies that employ it. The flames have died down now, leaving only ash where once a human stood. The crowd disperses slowly, some troubled by what they've witnessed, others satisfied that justice has been served. But the impact of burning alive, its terrible spectacle, its psychological horror, its symbolic power, continues to echo through centuries. We've journeyed from Viking longhouses to medieval town squares, from witch trials to heresy burnings, exploring humanity's most feared method of execution. We've discovered why even the Vikings, those warriors who welcomed glorious death in battle, trembled at the thought of the stake and flame. But our exploration raises questions that extend beyond historical curiosity. What execution method disturbs you most deeply? And what does that reveal about your own values and fears? How would you have responded had you lived in an era when burning was considered necessary justice? And what do our modern punishment systems reveal about our own cultural anxieties and values? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this journey through one of history's darkest practices illuminating, consider subscribing for more explorations of the complex, often troubling aspects of human history that continue to shape our understanding of justice, power, and society. The flames may be extinguished, but their light continues to illuminate the darkest corners of human nature and the societies we create. Until next time, remember that studying even history's most terrible practices helps us better understand not just where we came from, but who we are.